Order, order. Welcome to this morning's meeting of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. Today is our third session on children's TV and video content, and we're joined by three expert witnesses. Professor Amy Orben from the Digital Mental Health Group at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Gemma Taylor, who is the Associate Professor in Development Psychology at the University of Salford, and Professor Sam Wass, who is the Director of the Institute of Science of Early Years. Thank you so much for joining us today. You're all very welcome. Can I remind all members to declare any interests before they ask their questions, please? I think unusually what I'm going to do, because you are a group of real experts in this field, but in different parts of the sort of sector, can I just start by briefly asking you to describe your own area of research and how it relates to how children watch TV, and also what sort of age group of children you tend to specialise in your work. Can I start with you, please, Professor Wass?
Yeah, so I'm an expert very much in the 0 to 5 age range, so early years. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, so we do a lot of work taking brain recordings from children with a particular focus on what I want to be talking about today, which is how young children process sights and sounds differently to how adults process them, and the implications for how we should be optimizing early years content for young viewers. My particular emphasis in my research, which again I'm going to be talking about a lot today, is the interrelationship between concentration and stress, so our physiological stress systems in our body, so the relationship between how we pay attention to content on screen and our physiological stress. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Professor Orben. I don't think we've ever had a panel where we've had two professors and a doctor before. I feel very intimidated. Go on, Professor Orben.
Well, thanks for the invitation. So I'm Professor Orben. I lead the UK's largest team looking at digital media use and its impact on mental health and other health outcomes, mainly in adolescents. Do a lot of work on the science advice into government, so I sit on the Science Advisory Council for the Department of Education. I, for example, also sit on the Advisory Council for the Australian evaluation of the smart social media ban, and do a range of different activities, so also understand that interface a bit. I do mainly quantitative work across a range of different topics in this space.
Very good. Dr. Taylor.
Okay, again, also thank you for having me here. My research is basically all about children's development in the digital age, focusing very much on the early years. However, I am starting, I'm no expert right now, to look at neurodiverse children in the older age groups as well. Looking at things like children's language development, their ability to learn from screens, and also their social and emotional skills, and what they get from screens for that.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start the questioning, and Professor Wass, I'd like to start with you first. Now, in your evidence, you talk a lot about the sort of characteristics of children's TV and video content that are really important for very young children. And one of the things you talk about is pace. Mm-hmm. Why is the pace of a TV programme or a video so important for very young children?
Yeah, so basically, kind of to start from the idea that our brains are fundamentally prediction machines. So every single word that's coming out of my mouth as I'm talking, your brain is generating word by word a prediction for what I'm going to say next. So if I suddenly cabbage, then as I said that word cabbage, which was unexpected in the context, your brain would have generated a kind of mismatched response. And we know from that and lots of other studies that this is a fundamental aspect of how our brains work. Young brains process information very differently for the very simple reason that they don't have so much prior knowledge. They don't have so much prior expectation. So their ability to do this predictive brain processing is very, very different. So we know from lots of studies that have been conducted very recently that what kind of maximizes learning, what young brains need to learn from most effectively, is slow-paced, predictable interactions. Yeah? So they need the same thing to happen over and over again because they're not so good at making predictions, so they need repetition to help them to make predictions. But also, because of this lack of prior knowledge, because of the fact that, to put it very crudely, the wiring diagram of their brain is much messier, yeah? This process of making predictions takes much longer. Yeah? So this is why young brains seek out slow-paced, repetitious, predictable interactions, things like peekaboo, things like singing the same song over and over again, things like reading the same book over and over again. And what kind of screens, and the modern world in lots of other ways, like urbanization, but particularly screens are giving us, is exactly the opposite of that. Yeah? For reasons I'll get into kind of later, the makers of screen content are increasingly kind of packing content, and there's really, really good evidence that this is a trend that's going up over time. They're packing screen content with fast-paced, unpredictable content. Yeah? And this is, as I say, exactly the opposite of what young brains need. Yeah? And the other aspect of this, and this is the kind of area where I think this is really, really important, I'm really keen to talk about this, is we know from, again, lots and lots of studies that have looked at this in lots of different ways, that if I'm in a situation where information is coming at me that is too fast-paced, that is too unpredictable, and my brain is struggling to make predictions to keep up with the rate of information that's coming at me, we have a kind of inbuilt mechanism to put our bodies into this kind of high alert, kind of hypervigilance mode, yeah? Which makes sense if you think about it. I'm in an unpredictable situation. I better be ready to respond at a moment's notice, yeah? So this is our brain sending a signal to our bodies that we need to be ready to respond at the drop of a button. So we go into what's called fight or flight kind of physiological mode, where our heart starts to beat faster, we get increased energy release to our muscles, and so on and so forth, yeah? And the thing that I think is really important here is we've got kind of good quality evidence from lots of different sources that children, when they're watching this fast-paced content, which is coming at them too fast-paced for their brains to process, are going into this physiological state. Yeah? Lots and lots of good quality evidence for that. Yeah? There is also kind of more indirect evidence that this might be relating to the large number of studies that have come out, a lot over the past recent years, specifically pointing to associations between early screen use and later life kind of behavioural and emotional dysregulation. So some nice evidence from the Department of Education came out for that yesterday, but also more long-term, specifically at kind of affective mental health problems. So that's to do with kind of depression and anxiety. Yeah? And we know that the fast-paced content triggers kind of this hyper-alertness, hyper-awakeness in a part of the brain known as the brainstem, which is very strongly implicated in conditions like depression and anxiety. So I think there's a really good, quality case to be made that this fast-paced content that we're exposing a lot of young children to at an early age kind of may be relating to these kind of behavioural and physiological behavioural and emotional dysregulation and these later life kind of mental health problems.
Fascinating. One of the other things you talk about in your evidence is the importance of there being clarity of visual content. You say that includes being able to see key facial features and to identify emotion on the faces of characters. Why is that important?
So again, this goes back to the idea that I started with, which is that our brains are prediction machines. Yeah. So as I'm looking at your face, I'm generating kind of expectations for where I expect your facial features to lie, where the outline of your face is, how your face will move, and I'm generating those predictions based on my prior knowledge, my prior experience. Yeah. So young viewers have less prior knowledge, yeah? So they're not so good at making those predictions. And one of the things that's very well researched in neuroscience is one of the things that we naturally do when we're communicating with young people is we call it hyperarticulation. Yeah? So we look at this first in the context of kind of child-directed speech. Yeah? So parentese. So naturally, when we're talking to a baby, we say kind of "hello, baby," like that. Yeah? We exaggerate our mouth movements. Yeah? And the reason that we do this is because speech perception doesn't work so well in young brains, but if I exaggerate my mouth movements, that exaggerates the difference between my speech sounds, which helps a young child to tell apart my speech sounds given the fact that they're not very good at it. Yeah? So we can take exactly the same idea in terms of kind of visual design. Yeah? So this is why, most cartoon characters, yeah, have big black outlines around their eyes, yeah? And they have a big black outline around the edge of their face, yeah? It's kind of hyper-articulating a face in exactly the same way as we hyper-articulate speech, in a way to make kind of content easier to view, yeah? It's also why good quality TV does other things like kind of, we call it emotionese, yeah? Similar to parentese in speech, yeah? So when I'm doing, when I'm seeing my friend, for example, and Iggle Piggle and Upsy Daisy see each other in the night garden, yeah? They don't just wave and smile as we would when I naturally meet my friend who I'm pleased to meet. We kind of clap our hands and we jump for joy, yeah? Which is a way of hyper-articulating emotional expression, yeah? So good quality content for TV, for children, for young children, will use this kind of exaggerated clarity, yeah, of mouth movements in speech, of the visual design when we're thinking about the visual features, and of the kind of emotional content and of the narrative elements, yeah. But this is something very much that quite a small proportion of kind of children's TV is aware of, and it does properly. So I think this is, if we're thinking about, introducing guidance to help kind of parents to tell apart good quality content from less good content, I think this is a really, really important place to start.
Really fascinating. Thank you very much. Amy and Professor Orben and Dr. Taylor, can you just give us your views on what are the positive and negative aspects of content for very young children? I know, Professor Orben, you tend to concentrate on a more adolescent, but if you guys have any particular views on this.
Well, so I would add to sort of what Sam was saying about language being really important in children's video and TV content, making sure that it does marry up with what we call child-directed speech, so short, simple sentences, simple vocabulary, repeating new words and so on frequently. I would argue that that's really, really important for supporting children's early language development. And obviously this changes as children get older and they start acquiring more words. But I would argue that language is really important. There is a study looking at Bing, for example, showing that the language used in Bing is very similar to child-directed speech that you would use every day with children. And so it's more likely to support their language development because it's using those features.
And what evidence is there for how the content that very young children watch actually impacts their development over future years?
So there is good quality educational evidence with the language properties that I was mentioning can support children's language development. Absolutely, there is evidence. It's small, they're small correlations, but they're positive nonetheless. So that's the first thing to say. The other thing I would say is that you'll be more than aware that the evidence base is very much mixed. It's very much, not all studies look at content, they sometimes will just look at screen time, and that's a problem because not all content is educational and high quality. But if it's high quality, it can support their language development. If it's high quality, it can support their learning from, if they're learning maths concepts, for example. And if it's good quality, it can also support their socio-emotional development as well, so their social and emotional skills. But it's all dependent on content. I'm sorry to have to caveat, this is what we do as researchers, I'm afraid we caveat all the time, but it is very much dependent on that being good content. We can't generalise to all screen content available for children for those.
Thank you very much. Let's move to Cam, please.
Thank you, Chair. So as a father, I feel constantly in battle trying to stop my daughter asking me to put the iPad on where she watches all sort of mind-numbing tosh. But I do quite enjoy watching stuff, particularly that which I find on the iPlayer. She does watch Bing. She likes Bluey as well. I quite enjoy that, and she sort of quite regularly has to ask me to stop crying. But what is it? In what way is it beneficial for my daughter to be watching TV with me or with family members? Can I go to Dr. Taylor first?
Yes, it's incredibly important and beneficial. So if children are watching with another person, and the other person has to be actively watching, so not just passively sat there with them while you don't talk and interact. If you're talking and interacting about the content, whether that's during the screen time or after the screen time, that's going to support their learning from that content. And it kind of relates to what Sam was saying about pacing. So really good quality content that will support these sort of co-viewing interactions can't be too fast paced, otherwise there's no gap for you to be able to say anything. Is that you've missed half the story if you do that. So yes, it absolutely will support their learning if you're co-viewing and using it with them. And obviously you're enriching it then with additional language with the children as well. So.
Can I just make a couple of points?
Yeah, please.
Unless you're...
No.
Okay. So a couple of points just to add to what Gemma was saying. I think, so as I was saying earlier, naturally, not so much for things like Bing and Bluey, which are very much about everyday experiences, yeah? But when we're talking about, the type of content I was talking about earlier, very fast-paced, and particularly kind of world in peril type content, yeah? Even on, iPlayer, you get a lot of kind of world in peril type content. In addition to the pathways I was talking about earlier, through which, fast-paced content, which is unpredictable, triggers, us to go into this, fight or flight, ready to respond at a moment's notice node. There's also evidence that when we're watching kind of imaginary characters kind of dealing with an imaginary situation in which the world's in peril, children's bodies get tricked and respond to this imagined danger as if they're actually experiencing danger themselves. Yeah, so their bodies are again triggering this fight or flight mode. You might have to, run for your life at a moment's notice, even though it's all happening on a screen. Yeah. So for both of those reasons, there's really good quality evidence that a lot of the naturally occurring peaks in a child's stress occur during screen viewing. Yeah. And this is a point I think is really important to make to parents, because parents are very, very often unaware of it. Yeah? They'll notice things like, that's why kids are ratty when they come off screens. Yeah? They're in fight or flight mode. They've had a massive energy release to their muscles. Their bodies are ready for all of this activity. So they'll notice that children are ratty after they come off screens, but they won't be aware that it's the time when they're on screens that their hearts are going really, really fast. They're in this fight or flight mode. And when I think of my children experiencing their own moments of peak stress, there are definitely times that I want to be there with them. Yeah, I want to be experiencing this with them at the same time. Yeah, you can model how to respond appropriately to the stress. Yeah, the simple act of physical contact. Again, there's really, really good quality evidence that just sitting next to you, with you, attenuates your stress response. Yeah, so for a lot of those reasons, and also because you can talk about it afterwards. Yeah, you can discuss what happened. You can contextualize it. You can say it was imaginary, not real. All those types of things that are really important for children. So for that reason, I think that's a particularly important reason, helping children to cope with what is naturally their stress peaks during the day by experiencing it with them. Yeah. And then just really quickly, one more point I wanted to make. So there's also some evidence. So we do a lot of work with kind of dual brain recordings and looking at kind of synchrony in terms of brain activity and physiological activity. And one of the really important benefits, I think, from co-viewing, this comes in lots of different ways. It comes definitely from reading stories with your children at the same time. But there's really, really good quality evidence that simply experiencing things at the same time, whether it's in terms of brain synchrony or physiological synchrony, has this effect that, honestly, from a neuroscience point of view, it's quite mysterious as to how it happens, but it's very, very well proven that it does, which is that experiencing the same thing at the same time increases your feelings of mutual understanding with that person that you're experiencing it with. Yeah, it gives you a common frame of reference, stuff to talk about afterwards, but it also just kind of deepens your kind of mutual understanding and perspective taking. So those are all reasons why, co-viewing screens is a great idea. Yeah, it's so hard to do as a parent. We all know that, you just need your 5 minutes to clean the kitchen, chuck a screen at them. But if you can make it work, it's really, really important for lots and lots of different reasons.
Professor Orben, anything to add to those responses?
Well, I think, as Dr. Taylor said, there's a large range of different pieces of evidence, and so there was a big integration of all different studies in this space, and it did find that co-viewing and viewing of educational content, the amount you did that was positively associated with learning outcomes in children classified as 0 to 18, so not just early years. So I think that the evidence you've heard is backed up by the intricative process of putting together, I think, 88 different studies.
So you mentioned between the three of you sort of fit that physical contact, just the experience of experiencing that together. Anything else that my daughter or young children are sort of looking for from that shared experience?
I mean, do you want to talk a bit about language?
Yeah, as I said, so it will enrich their language environment if you're watching it with them and interacting with them during the screen and after the screen. So that's sort of one area, and obviously the screen itself and the high quality language there can enhance it, because it takes you outside of things that you might see in your everyday life. So it's quite a nice, like books do. You read and you introduce language from books because it's outside of what's around you now. So that's helpful.
Yeah, I don't really have any studies to add to that, but from a perspective as a parent, I would say, often it's quite hard to start conversations with your parents, with your children. You ask them how the school day was, you get a one-word answer back. But just getting them to talk you through the plot of a show that you've watched together. It's about just having a common frame of reference. It's about having something where you're both there together, experiencing something from exactly the same perspective. So much of the time, our interactions with our children are get up, get dressed, and you're getting through the practical stuff. And just having that, we're seeing something from the same perspective at the same time, is really, really important. As a stimulator of shared conversation, but also just from the point of view of it helps things, it would help them to see other things from your perspective, having you had that experience of seeing things from your child's perspective.
So at the risk of becoming a mansplainer, actually you think that my daughter would benefit from sort of recapping following an episode, sort of talking her through it at the time, post the episode? Yeah,
so that is an area where there is really good quality evidence. So kind of back to general principles for good screen content, particularly for young children, back to this idea of kind of young brains struggle to make predictions, struggle to keep up, and this idea of repetition is really, really important. And that firstly, it's about viewing the same thing again. Yeah, the genius of Teletubbies. You watch a 2-minute video clip, and then it goes back to the Teletubbies, and they say again. We as adults groan when we hear that because our brains have extracted the maximum information from it the first time we watched it, so we don't learn so much from viewing it again. So we hate the idea, but a 2-year-old loves it. Yeah, and there's really good quality evidence that watching the same thing again and watching. I think it was with 18-month-olds watching a video 5 times in a row, their attention goes up over time, yeah? And it's because each time they're learning more, their brains are getting better at making predictions. They struggle to process it, they struggle to understand what's happening the first time round, yeah? Second time round, they can predict what's going to happen better, so they actually learn from it better. Yeah? So good quality content will feature repetition all the way through, yeah? So this is like characters having an entrance song, yeah? Every time that Iggle Piggle enters, you have the Iggle Piggle song, yeah? It's about kind of particular elements repeating in different contexts within a story, yeah? It's about, Bing, they'll retell the story that what happened at the end of the show, yeah? In the Night Garden, they do that as well.
Bing does that, yeah.
Yeah, Bing does that, yeah. And that's a marker of good quality content, yeah? Children need to process the same information multiple times in different ways, and it helps them, yeah? So absolutely talking with your daughter afterwards about the show that you watched is a really, really crucial part of her learning and will definitely help. Yeah, good evidence for that.
I think when your daughter grows up, it will also be relevant in later childhood and in adolescence. So we do know that active engagement with content is critical. It's both when the content is positive, also when the content might be disturbing or having a negative impact on them. It's really critical to have that active communication pathways regardless of age. I think critically as well, just hearing both of you talk, that what is good for child development isn't different on screens than wherever else in a child's life. It's about varied activities. It's about good quality interaction. It's about strong caregiver bonds. I think we always need to think about that screens aren't this special, they are special in that they're engineered in certain ways, but what makes a good childhood is generally quite stable, and it's a good way to start judging, naturally probably putting your child in front of a screen for multiple hours and not engaging is bad, just like it would be leaving them somewhere else and not engaging with them. So I think something to think about when we're making these quite complex judgments as parents, as policymakers, as researchers.
Can I just come in and make a point? I half agree with that point and I half don't agree. Can I just say something quickly, or did you want to get on something else?
Very quickly, yeah.
Okay. So basically, so there are kind of what the really, really important thing that is different about screens to the real world, yeah, is that screens contain a constant flow of information, yeah? And we have in us inbuilt a very kind of early developing brain mechanism to automatically pay attention to movement when it's present anywhere in our visual field. Yeah, this is where autoplay adverts on the internet are incredibly distracting, and so on and so on. Yeah. This is developed, we think, for evolutionary reasons, because movement in our visual field used to index threat, but now it doesn't anymore, but we still have this inbuilt mechanism. Yeah? So basically, from a neuroscience point of view, there are 2 ways that children can pay attention to screens. One is comprehension-driven attention. Yeah? I understand what I'm seeing. Yeah? I've watched this repeatedly. It's at a pace and a developmental level which is inappropriate for me, so I understand the content that I'm being shown. Yeah? That's one way that we can get children to pay attention. But there's another way that we could get children to pay attention to screens, which is just simply by cramming more and more fast-paced movement into the screen. Yeah? And there are 2 very, very different ways that target very, very different brain mechanisms. We can articulate quite well the different brain mechanisms. Yeah? One is definitely good. Yeah? All the positive benefits that Gemma was talking about in terms of kind of impact on education all come through comprehension-driven attention. Yeah? But there is good quality evidence that increasingly program makers are using the latter approach. Yeah? Cramming constant movement into the screen. Yeah? To target these very, very low-level brain mechanisms that automatically draw our attention to movement, yeah? And the reason they do that is simple, yeah? Comprehension-driven attention builds up over time, yeah? It needs to be really, really slow-paced, which doesn't immediately grab you, yeah? First time you watch, you might struggle to pay attention. 5th time you watch, you understand it, so you're paying attention better as a 2-year-old, yeah? Whereas this, we call it salient-driven, kind of movement-driven attention is instantaneous. It works for everybody. It keeps you glued to the screen, even if you don't have a clue what it is that you're seeing. It's this very kind of built mechanism. So that, I would say, in response to your point, Amy, is a really, really important difference between screens, that screens kind of can be really, really packed with movement, and they increasingly are.
Yeah, and I'm not disputing that content and what's on the screen is a crucial determinant of the impact, and that what we watch, how we watch it, and critically also what it's displacing will be really important to consider the outcome of that viewing behaviour on the child, regardless of age.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, everyone.
Bayo.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panel. This is a question for Dr. Taylor, really, just to sort of touch on how, in terms of the interaction with regards to the content, how should parents sort of interact with content? Before you came in, we were talking about sort of musicals, and I think unanimously, I think the whole panel sort of spoke about their love of musicals, and I've got a 22-year-old and an 18-year-old 6-foot young men who know all the words to The Sound of Music. Oh. So yeah, it's a bit of dictation in my house. So anyway, so what I would say to you is, how should parents interact with the content that they're seeing with their children?
Okay, so the best, obviously we've talked a lot about talking about it, so I won't rehash that point. But taking what is on the screen into day-to-day world is the best opportunity. So I'll give you an example. Bluey is also my favourite children's television programme, I'm afraid. And so in Bluey, parents love to watch it, kids love to watch it, so it's going to naturally drive co-viewing. We're quite happy to sit and watch it together. The most important thing that we take away from it, though, is the games, the game ideas. We take them away. We've turned off Bluey at this point. There's a game, for example, in there. You might remember this, where the dad is an octopus. He's hanging over the sofa and he's an octopus. The children have to run past, and they have to run past, and he's trying to catch them. Okay. This is something that we've taken away from the screen, and we're doing then as a family, which is building play, essential for children's development. We've got the language happening, and as part of that episode, there's they research other types of octopus, and whether they've got electrocute them and things like that. So they're learning different things as well. So there's lots of ways that you can take what you're seeing on the screen into day-to-day life, expand on it, turn it into play, and make it a really incredibly enriching experience for children.
Brilliant. You can demonstrate Dad as an octopus for us all.
I have to regularly do horsey rides.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
It's another episode.
I won't get you to do that with any of us, because we could kill you. Vicky.
Thanks very much. So my questions are on support for parents, and as Cam has explained, your parents are quite desperate to make sure that they can go and get this right. So if there's anything that I'm not asking that you want to add in terms of this section, then this is probably where you may want to do it. So what could be done to make it easier for parents to choose high quality content for their children with confidence?
I'll jump in first, if that's okay. There's loads that can be done. Signposting is critical, and I pulled off an interesting statistic that I really wanted to share with you. So iPlayer, we can be fairly safe and secure that it's generally high quality for children, right? There was a study done, it was published last year, but it was based on survey data from 2020 in the US on YouTube. It asked 47 parents of 0 to 3-year-old children what YouTube videos their children have watched. So from that sample of over 400 videos, the researchers took that away, they coded those videos, and they looked at things like whether they were age appropriate or not. Are you ready for the statistic now? 19% of those videos were age appropriate for the 0 to 3-year-old children. So signposting on YouTube is essential for parents. Quite often parents will turn to screens when they are experiencing stress and burnout, and this is adding to their stress. We already know parents feel guilty when their children are consuming media. If they're turning to it because they're stressed, and then the guilt is adding to that, and they don't know if the content, if I was one of those parents and I heard that statistic and it was based on my data, I would be horrified, and that would add influence. So signposting, particularly on YouTube, is crucial.
And on that in particular, what about the YouTube Kids stuff? Is it because they're doing YouTube Everybody, or is it because they're on YouTube Kids?
I think even YouTube Kids is not. Yeah.
It would be really interesting if you've got any more statistics on that to get that at some point. Sorry.
Yeah, I just was going to come in just to add one point to Gemma, which is, so there is some posting. So there's I'm not quite sure how YouTube Kids differentiates between content for older viewers and younger children, but they do have some kind of a classification. Otherwise, on YouTube, to my knowledge, it's kind of, was this made for kids is the only criterion. And certainly in terms of the other, people like Netflix do kind of voluntarily kind of BBFC kind of following ratings, but at the moment, those ratings purely go off the thematic content. Yeah, does it have certain warning stuff? There's no element in any of the parent advisory about the stuff that I was talking about the complexity, how sensorily intense kind of the content is for young viewers. It's not factored in at all. It's perfectly possible to get a U rating for something that is mega, mega fast-paced, mega, mega flashbang word like that all the time. And, plenty of content does get that. And I think the reason that we're increasingly focusing with this screen time debate on early is exactly for the reasons that I was talking about at the beginning, that it is this fast-paced, unpredictable things that is affecting our brainstem, which is kind of having these kind of long-term effects. So this is definitely something we need to be looking at. We can't just be taking these kind of age-appropriateness ratings off the thematic content. We need to be looking at the structure, how's it designed? Is it kind of at a level, at an intensity, at a kind of level of predictability that is right for a young child, or is it too much for a young child? I think that's really, really important, and something's really got to change on that.
I think something else to add that becomes more important in later childhood as well is that more and more it's not just parents choosing content or the child, it's an algorithm, and the algorithm decides what to watch next. And that's sort of a really critical difference, because when I decide what to watch next actively, I state my preference. I weigh up, how do these different options look, and I choose. What algorithmically determine content processes, like especially on the short videos, but also on platforms like YouTube or Netflix does, is that it tries to infer what I might want to watch next. And this sort of revealed preference. And often some people talk about it like crisps or kale. I might really want to eat the kale, but I might end up snacking more on the crisps, and the algorithm learns that I like the crisps more, and it will feed me more of that. And I think that's a really critical difference, and something that I think it's very concerning that over the last few years we've increasingly seen that change. And that will have impacts on us into adulthood, but especially also in older children, where they're exploring their identity, they're building their beliefs about society, they're building their beliefs about themselves. And that time, I think that can be really, really sensitive, just as well as with young children, where I know researchers are very concerned that the couple of videos you first watch might end up training the algorithm, and that might even reinforce, for example, disadvantage if your algorithm tracks you, and what your parents put on in the first few years of life might determine what the algorithm thinks later on. Naturally, we don't have evidence of that specifically, but I think those are the design features that remove certain form of agency from the parent, from the child, and from us as adults, that I think we really need to critically examine, especially because they're so successful designs that they've now been rolled out across a huge amount of different media platforms.
Brilliant. So it's quite worrying in terms of the stuff that you say, but kind of what kind of things might help? For example, would some form of kite marking help? Would a hub app aggregating trusting content from public service broadcasters help? What kind of things do we think might be able to deal with stuff? And I think you touched on the BBFC and how they do their age ratings. Do they need to re-look in terms of what gets different kind of ratings in terms of stuff?
Yeah, that's all I have to say. I agree. We all of those things need to be put in place ideally. When we're talking about very young children, and this is forming the foundation of their development moving forward, we really need to be putting evidence, particularly in the early years stuff, but also, sorry, I'm at risk of a rant now. For the older children, I think it's more about developing their digital literacy skills, actually. Yes, we need the platforms to support, but we need to be teaching them the skills in the first place. We need the platforms to work for the early years, I think, but then we need to educate children to develop those skills that they need moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, I think it's also an Ofcom thing. So Ofcom has a regulatory duty to regulate harmful content. So, the warning, this contains flashing images which might be trigger kind of epilepsy, some forms of epilepsy. That comes from Ofcom. So the stuff that I've been talking about, the quite new kind of knowledge about how children process sights and sounds differently and that type of stuff, and the potential kind of the long-term effects of that, I think that's an Ofcom issue. This is a kind of harmful content thing. It's not so much a BBFC, but I know that this is outside of my thing, but I know that the remit of Ofcom is limited and it's only kind of UK-based kind of on-demand services that it regulates. But yeah.
Well, I think also good quality content takes investment, and I think we've moved to a world where we increasingly think our media should be free. And I think we need to really consider how we invest in this space and we support good quality content creation in the creative industries and elsewhere in the UK.
And so who should be responsible for providing the guidance and support for parents? Should it be the platforms or should it be government or...?
It needs to be both, realistically. If we're going to tackle this and tackle it well, it needs to come from all angles.
I think your question talked about guidance, so I think guidance needs to come from quite trusted sources, and I think it should be centralized. If you get guidance from YouTube and guidance from here, so I think having a trusted voice as guidance. But I think what critically platforms are often in charge of design. It's very difficult to regulate design properly, and it's actually design and the content that's being displayed that is in their remit. I think we need a lot more focus on safe technologies by design, which includes good quality content. In early years, it includes a lot of other things we've talked about for long periods of time. And I think we need to understand what different entities in this ecosystem can focus on best. I do think that pushing platforms to think about these engagement-based content, the want to ensnare attention for profit, for ad revenue, is something we need to critically examine. I don't know if just adding more guidance it's really important, and literacy is important, but we also need to develop an environment that is beneficial for children and young people. And I sometimes find literacy is also a sticking plaster when the issue itself is the design and the commodification of things like children's attention. And our attention as well.
Thanks, Vicky. Damien, did you want to come in?
Thank you, yes. A couple of months ago, I put a parliamentary question to the government to ask what research they'd commissioned on the effect of media on babies and toddlers. And the answer that came back was, well, we expect the platforms to do a risk assessment and think about the effect it will have on children. In other words, it didn't seem to say that the government had commissioned anything. I mean, this was the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and arguably this isn't really their arena at all, and you would be wanting to hear from the Department for Education or the National Health Service about some of these questions instead. So, my question to you is, you must interact with the public sector. What is your understanding of the appetite of all these different branches of government to develop a kind of a knowledge base? So, then I suppose the advice comes after that, but to understand what's really going on in the same way that we've spent masses of energy understanding formula milk versus breastfeeding or 5 a day or exercise or what have you.
I can go in on. I think we have a chronic lack of public sector research and development investment in understanding the impact of digital technologies on children, parents, and on our society. If you think, you talked a bit about food, and in food we have food standards agency, or whatever it's called, where there is investment in research centers that test the safety of food. If we think about other industries, there's often an interplay between industry safety testing, but also public sector safety testing. In the digital technology space, there's increasingly a fundamental decrease of trust that companies are ensuring their products are safe. We're in this state of companies bringing out minimum viable products at speed, partially because that's what's needed to stay competitive in a very fluid technology market. But that means that there are products released that the public believes, and policymakers and researchers, that there is very little testing whether those things are safe, whether that's kids' content, whether that's other forms of digital platforms. What then happens is that often to create policy, we want to show that there's harm. We want to have evidence that there's something that is wrong. And that evidence creation gets outsourced to university researchers, university research teams, or teams in civil society organizations who work on insubstantial short-term research grants that take a couple of years to get and then a couple of years to do. And then the evidence that's created is too late, too little, and not targeted to the policy questions, the questions that parents have on the doorstep, for example. So I think we need to fundamentally rethink how we support our understanding of the digital world. And we need to think about how we've done so in other industries. I welcome the investment of the previous government in the AI Security Institute, but I also feel like there's 100 million to give to long-term AI security. There was practically nothing to the security of our children now. I think that shows a lack of long-term interest. We hear that there's interest for many years, and I've been sitting on these committees for many years, but I think what's actually changed for us on the ground and providing the evidence is very little. My last point there as well is that we also need to think about where does evidence sit in this space. We often talk about cars. We've regulated cars. There are seatbelts, there are MOTs, there's traffic safety teaching in schools. But we had, I think, about 100 years between the first car and the 10 millionth car being sold in the UK. I think for TikTok, now one of the predominant content consumption platforms for older children, I think we had 2 years. Yeah. So I think we also need to think more agile about how we create that evidence and how we make decisions. We can't wait for the perfect evidence.
Let's put you in the policy, or any of the three of you in the policymakers' chair. So we heard yesterday, was it, that there is now going to be guidance on screen time and I think content type for babies and toddlers. So given that somebody will have to come up with something in pretty short order and all of this research work cannot be short-circuited, what should be in that advice?
So I would say really important, content needs to be structured differently for young brains compared to the older brains, yeah? For the reasons I was saying.
Hang on, so this, I think this is going to be advice to parents. So saying this whole industry should go away and do something different, good luck, but that's at one remove and you're dealing with people in a lot of them in another jurisdiction. Yeah. If there's going to be advice, and I hope it will be from either the Department for Education or the Health Service, to families, what should that advice say?
And also on the back, and also the guidance is going to be just on screen time. So should it be on something?
Very good point.
Yeah. So I would say very, very important, not just screen time. There's definitely massive differences between different ways of using screens. There's screen content which is very well designed for young brains. There's screen content that's extremely poorly designed. We have this active selectionary pressure that I was talking about earlier, which is the more movement and fast-paced content that you pack into a screen content, the more a child will look at the television because of these automatic, inbuilt, involuntary attention mechanisms that have got nothing to do with whether we understand the content that's being viewed, whether we're at all engaged and interested in it. It's very, very, very hard for anyone, even an adult, but particularly a young child, to experience movement in their visual field and not look at it. So that's really, really, really important.
I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to say what should this guidance be. But the challenge back to you, Sam, if I may, would be, okay, that's all very well, but what you expect now every mother and father in the land to be an expert on neuro development and being able to categorise different pieces of content and being constantly at the shoulder of their young child. Realistically, and that's perhaps why screen time is a much easier thing to give advice on than content. What actually is the practical advice that you're giving to Cap with I don't know how old you're with his 4-year-old?
I think it's difficult for me to comment. I've been involved in the DFE conversations, and actually we will release those guidelines in April. I think it needs a conversation that's not just about the evidence, it's about the ethics, it's about people with lived experience, about what parents need. So I think research will play one role. think critically we need to think about that there are guidelines in this place already that I think are really important to think about. The WHO guidelines that recommends 1 to 2 hours for under twos. And I think the CMO guidelines talking about things like not having screens at the family meal times, not having screens in the bedroom, not having screens potentially an hour before bed. All of these are already guidelines out there that I think are evidence-based and really important for us to communicate. I had a call from the BBC last summer, I think it was the Today programme, that they'd done a study on kids not putting their phones in the bedroom and found real positives. And I welcomed it, and I said, well, that has been the guidance for, I think about five years. So I think there's also communication where we can give guidance, but it needs to meet the parents where they are, and it needs to be realistic for them as well.
I think that phones in the bedroom and stuff, that is mostly about older children.
No, I'll let Gemma
I think if I've understood correctly, what we're going to get in April is also coming right down to the earliest years. And there are questions around early brain development and more children presenting in year R with attention difficulties and so on. So hopefully that will move us on. But so Gemma, what should be the policy? What should be the advice?
It's a big question, and I do sit in this space as a parent as well as a researcher. I've got a 4 and a 7-year-old. So for me, obviously, yes, you can't always honour the screen time guidance. I will admit that myself. It's just not always possible. But what I do try to do if I can't be there with the children while they're watching content is to make sure that content at least has tried to have some kind of educational value, and it's not just the videos on YouTube that don't, they're just videos. So that's the first thing. Try and get a sense of whether or not the content is educational. Co-view with them if you can, because it's, and take whatever they've learned beyond the screen. But crucially, as Amy said, it's about meeting families where they're at. So different parents have different needs at different times, whether that's based on their stress and whatnot, but also different children. So neurodiverse children benefit from screens in different ways than what we've really considered so far. And I'm speaking about slightly sort of 4 to 16-year-olds, for example, with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. This is where they've had some kind of brain changes as a result of exposure to alcohol during pregnancy. Those children have challenges with their social skills and their emotional skills, but they use YouTube videos to learn about how to interact in everyday situations and so on and so forth. So, and some parents say that they need those screens to support them during moments where they are feeling emotionally overwhelmed, and they can turn to something that is predictable content to calm down. So actually, it's about meeting individual families where they're at according to this is not good guidance, I'm aware of that.
So I've realised I'm stretching our chair's patience a little bit, because as this is only one follow-on question, but can I just ask one more, and then maybe, if you'll forgive me, come back later on. Can I just put to you a proposition that it's not realistic in an algorithmically driven system to say parents should control what their children watch, because even if you do a lot of the time, even if you do manage to co-view, let's say you have 3 children, as it happens we do, as well as all the other things you have to do, it just physically is not possible to be there all the time. And so shouldn't it just be a channel?
Should it just be a channel?
Yeah, do you remember them? I mean, and why is no one arguing this? Why is no one saying it is impossible to say, I'm going to pick all these individual 1, 5, 10-minute, 20-minute pieces of content and put them all together and know which ones are good and which ones are bad? That's what channels are for. That's what we call them. We call them curated playlists in another part of the media landscape. I mean, why isn't there just a drive to say, let's bring back responsible, well-edited channels?
So there is evidence that, curiosity-driven exploration, so if you get a child to ask a question before you tell them the answer, they remember the answer better. Even in early years, we've done quite a lot of work at this, looking at, child-led attention. So getting them to, click, even that interactivity of swipe on TikTok, but, particularly for early years when thinking about things. So if I express curiosity, if I choose to watch something, then I engage with that content differently. So that's true. But the other thing about, children's urges, particularly the stuff I've been talking about, it's very hard not to look at fast-paced, kind of densely packed visual content, is something you want to steer children away from. So I would say ideally you need, curated choice where we know everything that goes in the basket, but they are given the choice about what they pick out of when.
We survived. How did we grow up into these adults?
We didn't have Wi-Fi, Damien. That's the difference.
I think it's also about that naturally they'll grow up into very different age, and they'll need very different skills. And I think that those policy decisions, we can just advise on where there's evidence. I think there's partially that will be a policy decision about how exactly to act on that evidence.
But part of the advice could be, if the proposition that I put was correct, and maybe it's not, but if it was, part of the advice could be, if you're going to put your child in front of something for an hour, you're much safer putting them in front of one of these few public service media channels for an hour than sticking them in front of and it's not really self-selection, is it? Although, to be fair, I think that the children's versions don't do autoplay, but a lot of children are also not using children's versions. So that's not really self-selection. That is kind of people like you looked at things like this. Yeah. So wouldn't the safer advice possibly be, some other professionals have looked at this and they've come up with a set of stuff that probably is a little bit educational but also entertaining and engaging. You're better off there.
I do agree. I think just as a general principle, we're in one area where it worked for us as kids. We turned out fine. It must work. But that doesn't work for the very simple reason that since screens have become ubiquitous, iPhone 2009, iPad 2010, really the amount of content that children are watching, no parent can resist. You're in the queue at a shop, pull out Peppa Pig, and your hyperkinetic toddler just goes motionless. You're waiting for your food to come at a restaurant. And really, there's so much evidence. It just came out of the Department of Education yesterday that 98% of 2-year-olds watch television for an average of 127 minutes a day. So this really isn't something where we can say, we watch screens, because just the amount and the timing and the spacing, as well as this trend that I've been talking about more and more fast-paced, movement-driven attention capture, that type of stuff. So what worked for us is our kids are experiencing a very, very different world.
Yeah, that might be an argument in favour of preferring channels, not against.
Yeah.
Thank you. Cam, did you want to come in?
Really quickly, Chair, I promise. Okay, so we've now got fact checkers which show people how likely it is that what news channels they're reading from, what media organisations they're reading from, can be relied upon to be telling the truth. What if we had a similar standard that was applied to children's media sources, YouTube, whatever else? And furthermore, we spoke about food briefly. We have a traffic light system which shows people this piece of food is green here, it's yellow here, it's red on saturated fats, whatever it is, it's terrible for you. What if we were to apply that based on an authoritative, an approved authority? What if we were to apply that to specific programmes?
So I can answer on the latter one. I think absolutely, in terms of what we've been saying, you can't supervise your kids all the time. Just having a green, yellow, red flag for, kind of, you type in the age of your content, it gives you a green, yellow, red flag for how age appropriate it is. Great. We're very, very long way from that. We're at the level of these very, very crude, maximum number of hours of screen content. No real awareness about the idea, beyond this very crude thematic
we've got to get there, but that we're a long way from it.
Yeah. I absolutely think that's really important, but we really need a lot more research about this idea of how the content and the design of TV is different it needs to be different for young brains to older brains. And it's really important, but there's a lot of research that needs to happen. Yeah.
Professor Orben, if you'd like to jump in.
I think it would also have to be scalable. So we're now where on certain platforms there's a lot of user-generated content, so it's not like movie kite marking. So it would need to be something, I guess, that could be done automatically through some sort of
perhaps
AI
on the
coding.
basis of how reliable that source is expected to be.
Potentially, yeah. I think those sorts of policy options, research will be able to help advise, but you'll quickly see that there is a lack of our ability to keep up with those sorts of changes. So I think the question will also be of who and how in the long term.
Dr. Taylor, would you like to close?
I don't have much to say on the topic, actually. Any sort of guidance for parents.
Very good. Thanks, Cam. Let's go to Liz, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to focus on the impact of YouTube and TikTok on older children and teenagers. There was a case in the Sunday Times at the weekend of a young man who had watched a video at the age of 12 and had been diagnosed with PTSD as a result of seeing that video, which was originally on Facebook and then migrated to YouTube and TikTok. I wonder, Professor Orben, if you could just talk about the main well-being risks associated with these platforms.
I think so. The first thing to think about that, for example, that case which I also read on Sunday, is we need to differentiate between individual level harms and risks and population level harms and risks. So I think on a lot of these platforms we have quite clear evidence of individual level harms, from the boy in the paper on Sunday to Molly Russell, and whose content so heavily impacted her, to a wide range of children we've seen in coroner's reports and investigative journalism. And for a lot of industries, that would be enough to drive change. For example, if you would think about a toy that caused certain amounts of, a couple of children real grave harm, you would expect a certain level of recall. Naturally, you wouldn't expect recall of all toys. And so I think that's where the difficulty lies at times. On the population level, we have, so I'll focus specifically on video content because this is the focus of this committee. So we do find that so in this review of the 88 studies, we do find that there's a negative and weak association between more time spent watching all types of video content and learning and mental health outcomes. So naturally, we talked a bit at the beginning that certain types of educational content or co-viewing content have these positive associations, but the baseline was negative. There was an economic modeling exercise that was recently published, I think in November, where they looked at the potential impact of an hour spent more watching videos in childhood on US samples, and they did find a decrease for every additional hour you spent watching videos as a whole. And that was specifically on socio-emotional skills and on internalizing behaviors. So being with your peers, but also about things like depression and anxiety. They actually found positive impacts on things like maths and cognitive skills. So I think we have this understanding that there are clear harms on individuals, and those need to be targeted and they need to be addressed. On the population level, we have increasing understanding that there's probably kind of more video viewing will likely lead to smaller decreases in certain outcomes, especially in that mental health well-being space, potentially less in that cognitive for older children. But that is very variable, and as you said, we're not honing in on a specific platform with specific designs or specific pieces of content. I don't think we need evidence to show that. I think it was 2 years ago where on X, the most searched term was kitten in a blender, and a lot of young people were watching those in school, and I don't think you need a study to show that the amount of minutes spent watching videos like that will have a negative impact on developing brains as well as adult brains, to be perfectly honest.
You have touched on this briefly, but what additional challenges does AI and the ever-increasing AI slop present for children? What is the best way to address AI?
I think there's two bits there. There's the algorithmically determined short-form video content that I think from the way we as humans make decisions, really much harder to disengage from. It's almost like people would say like a slot machine. You don't know what's coming next. It might be the funniest video you've seen. And you don't need to choose what to watch next. You just need to choose whether to swipe or not, which is very different to even social media or YouTube a couple of years ago, where you would have to search and choose what to watch next, and where the videos weren't kind of in this real format, which is the video, and then you swipe and you see the next. So I think since then we've seen increasing number of those children do talk about struggles with agency, feeling not in control of their own use, which I think is very concerning. There is some really nice qualitative research on young people's use of Instagram and TikTok, where they talk about that they're bored and they go online, and it's like content soup. They're wading through this content soup, and they actually get more and more bored, but they find they struggle to disengage. And I think that is critically, again, based on design. It's the design that that keeps them engaged. And we see that that design is very good at keeping them engaged because TikTok pioneered it. We're now seeing it on Instagram, we're seeing it on YouTube, we're seeing it on Facebook, we're even seeing Reels on LinkedIn. And I think that should be seen as something we need to consider. So what we can do about it is, I think, naturally we need to think about how we regulate for platforms. We know we could make platforms safer by design. The question is, do we trust that we can do this? And can we trust that we can do this quickly enough? It's kind of like, do we regulate this like junk food, or do we regulate this like cigarettes? And it's not something, this is a decision that has to be made not by researchers, not by policymakers, it's us together figuring out what is feasibly possible. And I don't think we've seen a lot of progress in the last 10 years on making certain technologies young people use safer. I think we also need to think about user choice. So there's a lot of work on adults showing that people want to choose how their platforms are designed. And in the old internet, we used to be able to say, well, I want this here, and I don't actually want Reels, and I actually don't want to be have this feature. And it's like in my physical environment, I can choose how to organize my desk to fit how I want to work. I think increasingly in the app-based age, we have no agency, or it's hidden somewhere in some sort of place on the app which we can't easily find, where we can decide whether that we want this or not. So I think empowering user choice, especially in older adolescents and in adults, will also be critical.
What do you think about the idea of banning smartphones and social media access for under 16s? Do you think what kind of impact would that have?
It's a really interesting question. So there's not been an experimental study reducing or removing social media in under 16s and seeing what happens. So it's very difficult for us in healthy. So there's been one in those that show certain symptoms of mental health conditions. It's very hard for us to understand the impact of a policy like that, both in terms of its effectivity and then its ultimate impact. I think, therefore, I'm really excited to be involved in the evaluation of the Australian ban. I think we should, over the next few months, start seeing a bit how that has worked. And I think that will help inform us, importantly, on how that has gone. If it does improve well-being and mental health across the board, it should be an option on the table. But it's very hard as a researcher to be able to judge what it might lead to at the moment. We are running a trial in Bradford where we're going to put in place a social media curfew and a reduction of social media use to 1 hour a day across Bradfordian schools for 6 weeks to see the impact. So that was just funded, and that was directly informed by some of the policy options that were on the table earlier last year. So that sort of evidence, I think, will be critical. I think otherwise it's something where it would be hard for me to make a prediction.
Okay. TikTok has a wind down mode that prompts under 18s to turn off at 10 p.m. Do some young TikTok users have trouble sleeping, in your experience?
I think there's some of the clearest evidence of social media harms is in the sleep area. And I think sleep, especially, in any type, age of children and young people, is really critical. In adolescence, it's one of the most predictive elements of mental health outcomes over the course of development. There's this really interesting report from the Youth Futures Foundation published last year where they looked at the decrease in mental health in adolescents over the last 20 years and tried to see, what has changed at a similar rate. And actually, sleep quality has declined at a similar rate. Digital technologies has gone up, and there were changes in deprivation and economic circumstance. So they couldn't pinpoint, but I think sleep is really critical, and therefore that's why earlier in this session I talked about the CMO guidelines on no phones and screens in bedrooms and no phones and screens an hour before bed that I think are really critical, and we need to get that out to parents. I struggle with layering more and more policy or regulation or guidance on top of when we're not yet enforcing or enacting appropriately things like the Online Safety Act, things like the guidance we have already in place. I think that needs to be considered.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Liz. Damien, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, can I have a couple of very quick fire follow-ups? First of all, away from TikTok and YouTube, is there any evidence on any harm or goodness that comes from binge watching on something like Netflix relative to waiting a week for the next episode, or do we just not know?
Right, I wouldn't know.
Okay, and to Gemma.
The only stuff on that I do know is if it's used to control behavioural dysregulation, so if you use it to stop a tantrum, with young, back to early years, then there's good quality evidence come out recently from some colleagues of mine in the States that is associated with the tantrums getting worse over time rather than less.
Associated with what, sorry?
So if you use it to stop a toddler tantrum, you put out a screen to stop a toddler tantrum, that's a counterproductive technique, so it leads to the increase in severity of toddler tantrums over time. But otherwise, I think it's just general correlational in terms of kind of total amount of screen content.
Yeah, I think it's mainly thinking about displacement, right? If you're watching 6 hours
what are you not doing?
On the weekend, what are you not doing? Are you not going, interacting with your community? So I would think about that.
Okay, quick to Gemma. Any evidence on the turn on the subtitles campaign? Is it beneficial to very young children to have the subtitles on when they're hearing speech on television?
Again, I don't know if there's any research on that, unless you guys know. I can't imagine it'd be helpful in the very early years, because you ask them to do different things, and that's a challenge. But yeah, I think we would need research evidence on the age at which that becomes beneficial.
Okay, and to any of you, have you ever met a parent who has used every parental control available to them with 2 or 3 children, 2 different operating systems, 3 different Meta apps, 2 different Google apps? Have you ever met anybody who's mastered the parental controls?
I think
can you introduce
importantly,
me to them? We will have them here at the committee.
If that sort of perfect parent exists, they're probably going to be highly educated, and in certain forms of parts of probably not. I think it creates a differential in society where we have parents who need to make those choices about which child gets exposure to that or not. So I think we need. I haven't met them, but I think
it was kind of a rhetorical question. My hypothesis is that person does not exist because it's not physically possible. However well educated you are, you just cannot be on top of all these different systems. They all have their own individual parental. TikTok says we've got parental controls. Well, that's fine, except the child has just been on Instagram, and I've been worrying about those parental controls. So, is it probably fair to say that no parent realistically can be on top of all the parental controls?
And who's better than their kids at 10?
And who's better? Yes, exactly. Thank you, Gemma.
And then by the time their child gets to teenage years, they'll be creating a VPN to get around them anyway.
Yep. Exactly.
Annalise, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much for coming to give evidence to us. It's been really fascinating. I suppose we've talked around challenges and pitfalls of video sharing platforms a lot, and I'd just like to see what the panel think in terms of positive benefits of video sharing platforms like YouTube and TikTok. So I suppose I'll start by asking all of you, what do you think the benefits are? Amy, if you want to start.
Yeah.
Well, I think just like with the negatives, it's all about content, who's watching, with whom, at what point, and for what purpose. So I think purposeful, good quality content consumption can, qualitative evidence shows it can be transformational for some children who are looking for a specific piece of information, maybe in adolescents who are struggling with a certain part of their lives. Can be highly educational. I do admissions interviews at Cambridge, and we see people coming through our doors who've taught themselves whole curricula through watching things on YouTube. I think it can allow young people agency if there are certain opportunities not in the home to get that information, to get certain forms of content or educational content. So I think that is something that we need to recognize, and it's often the most vulnerable that find potentially the most harm, but also potentially the most benefit, which makes it quite a difficult space to judge who's the most at risk, but also who might most benefit from access versus not access. So I think, like with harms, it will be very specific types of content in specific situations that lead to benefits.
Gemma? I agree with everything Amy said, and just to emphasise again about neurodiverse children and their ability to find content on YouTube that can support maybe different areas that they would like extra support with is really helpful for them. And likewise, you know, we've probably all gone down a hole where we want to learn something new, and you know, we can find those videos. So high quality content is there and supportive and beneficial. It's just finding it. That's the problem.
And how does that relate to the algorithms then, in terms of?
I honestly couldn't comment on the algorithms. It's a mystery to me.
No, I wasn't going to say about that. I was going to say about the contingency, as Amy was saying. And I mean, one of the things that the algorithms actually try to discourage, which is, you know, from what Gemma was just saying about neurodivergent children, I was talking earlier about kind of repetition and how that's really, really important for young viewers in terms of this kind of gaining some predictability. And one of the ways that neurodivergent children use technology differently is they'll often watch the same video over and over again, which is exactly the same as this early years kind of learning mechanism. It just continues much later because, you know, their brains find it harder to find things predictable over time. So I think the algorithms don't like that. They want you to be moving on to different content. So a lot of the time, you know, they are kind of against one another.
Well, I think the algorithm can create positive and negative feedback cycles. So I think the richer get richer, the poorer get poorer, in the sort of theory in this space that, in the media space that has existed for a long time, that if you're the child who has a certain hobby, who's feeling very settled in their school, then those algorithms might be feeding you more information about that hobby. While if you're a child who's experiencing a lot of stress at school, where something's really causing you a lot of anxiety or putting a lot of pressure on you, might going into those negative feedback loops. So I think, like all technologies, they create more extremes, and we need to understand how do we support those positives while also safeguarding those who will be experiencing those negative impacts or those negative feedback loops.
So going on from that, you've all touched on it's about the content and the high quality content. So do you think that the video sharing platforms are doing enough currently to make sure that educational and high quality content is more prominent?
I don't know what to say on that.
I would just say no, probably not. I don't think so. But that's an opinion.
I think in the AI age, this will be increasingly challenging, and we need companies and platforms who are serious that they have a responsibility for those people on their platforms. And I think there have been times where that has been less clear to me. And I think in the time of AI-generated content, where your algorithm might not just decide what video you watch next, but create that video for you, those will be challenges that is coming down the line for committees like yours. So I think if we have concerns now, they will not become easier or less, they will just increase.
And we know that traditional broadcasters, public service broadcasters, are developing content to be placed on these video sharing platforms because they know that that's what kids are watching, and that's where the audience is. So if you were advising them, what would you tell them to do to maintain educational and positive elements of the programmes, no matter what that platform is? What would your advice be to them, like, increasingly moving into that space and wanting a more, like, you know, to be up there, like, on the algorithm, so that high quality programming is, like...
I've got a lot of respect for colleagues, for example, in the BBC, who really try very hard to create high quality programming. I think they live in a world where currently there are certain choices and the way that technologies are set up that are playing against them. So I think there has been now changes going through Parliament, I think, on making sure that there's an iPlayer button on remotes, making sure that we have easy access to public service broadcasting. I think those are critical to give them the tools so that they don't have to compete as much. But I think critically we do need our public service broadcasting to compete in that frame at the moment. So I think my advice is actually we need to create a system where they can make those best choices without the pressure to compete with potentially things that are, for example, what you were saying, just the colors and the attention-grabbing content. Like, how can we create a system that is supporting the high-quality content that might more be like the kale rather than the crisps? And I think we cannot just make, for example, the BBC solve that. that is a ecosystem choice that would allow them to make those choices. If the system continues, then I think they will have to pivot in certain ways that I cannot, for example, say view as negatively if that's what they're having to do to keep certain audiences. But that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think the only things I'd add to that are, so from an earliest perspective, it's very much about, how the programme is made. That's the really, really important point where I think there needs to be a lot of change to happen on that. But, it is tricky because, as I was saying earlier, you have these two things that are very, very directly in opposition against each other. One is slow-paced, kind of comprehension-driven attention, which doesn't, is because it's slow-paced, it doesn't immediately grab you, yeah? And then the other is this automatic attention capture, yeah? Which works instantaneously, irrespective of, whether you understand or are interested. It's really hard to look away from movement. And it's really, really hard when these two things are so directly in opposition. One's definitely good, the other's definitely bad, but just one has immediate rewards and the other doesn't. It's really, really hard to think about how to disentangle those two things and reward the slow-paced kind of comprehension-driven attention. It's really hard to think how to do that.
It also impacts older children and adults, right? Our intentions being grabbed from all different types of content, and the good quality might be washed out. There's this really interesting trial in Denmark where they looked at 13 to 17-year-olds, and they started adding friction into their social media use. So whenever you wanted to open TikTok, it gave you a 6-second break, and you were asked to take a breath. And only then were you allowed to enter. And they found a 31 to 36% reduction in the amount of use. So I think that was about, I think it's about an hour additionally for other activities without a decrease in enjoyment. So I think there are ways in which we can, again, through design where everything's become so frictionless, everything's become so optimized to grab our attention, we need to start bringing those back in. So I have been in contact, for example, with the BBC R&D department, who are quite interested in interventions like this. Like, could public service broadcasting not just be content, but helping parents, for example, install certain things like those break features and have a trusted resource that helps you manage screens and media. I think there is a lot of interest, and I think that's where world-class public service broadcasting and research and development capacity in the BBC could be of use.
I suppose my final question sort of on that, in terms of what place you think that research has to play in this to make it more beneficial, and do you think that how do you think the balance is at the moment in terms of health harms with these platforms on digital media vis-a-vis the kind of things that could be more beneficial and how they could use to be,
I mean, the only thing I'd say on that was what I was saying earlier, that we don't, at the moment, it's definitely not the case that all screen content affects young children in the same way. It's definitely the case that there's good quality content and bad quality content. This is about the programme design, the pacing, the kind of complexity of narratives, that type of stuff. But we don't have reliable measures for telling, ideally automatically whether something is age appropriate or not. It's definitely possible, it's a research aim that's really, really important, but we don't have that at the moment. And it's really crucial because all screen time is not the same. Some screen content is absolutely fine for a 2-year-old to watch, some really, really isn't. And we don't have a way to tell them apart at the moment.
Right.
Yeah, and researchers should just be embedded, I think, as much as possible into the development of content, but also how the ratings of content and so on and so forth. And I suspect that, things that we're concerned about today, they're going to change, and it's important that research moves with that so that we can continue generating the new knowledge that we need to make informed decisions.
I think my only 2 points is that evidence creation needs to be proactive. I'm sure in 5 or 10 years we'll sit here talking about AI companions or AI content, and it pains me that I'm not already working on that, and I'm working on social media. And so we need to think proactively and get ahead. When I talk to Apple researchers, I now think 5-6 years ago, and they were asking me only about companions and virtual companions, and now I'm like, well, I now understand where their heads were at, and I think we need to start thinking like that. And I think we need more research that is directly relevant to policy. Often, these instances are really nice for us to communicate and to connect, but often I find there's really great research done, but then it's not relevant, and then there's policy that needs research, but it's not there. In the health sector, so DSHC does fund something called a policy research unit, which is a group of researchers on a specific topic that I think sit down with the department every half year or a year to figure out exactly what question they want to answer, what's policy relevant, and then they do the research, the systematic review, the quick experimental study. I think we can think a bit more in that way. So I think it needs a redesign so that we're really working together, because any waste of time, effort, funding will mean that there won't be the evidence in time to help you make those decisions that your constituents want you to make.
Thank you.
Thanks, Annalise. Yes.
Well, obviously, academic independence and freedom is also very important. You can't only be working to the requirements of government or some agency. But just, I mean, we're going to be writing a report with recommendations. Would a recommendation of yours be that, say, annually there should be some, and probably some publicly available discussion about what are the things that we as a society, through the government, because that's the channel through which it goes, that we as a society think it's most important for the academic community to be researching in this arena?
I guess you get some of this through the areas of research interest that the departments release, but I think naturally what we need is curiosity-driven basic research, but I think there is this key element where, for example, through my now interaction with a range of departments, often it's like, well, we needed the evidence like yesterday, or if you create it, it will take you 2-3 years, and that will not be quick enough. So I think it needs that conversation, but like in the DSHC, if you fund something in a stable way so that the research is already there, the expertise is there, so that you can quickly do that trial, or you can quickly do that review, I think that's where then that potential, wait of 12 months a minister can deal with, a wait of 24 months, it's sort of off the table. And I've seen that paralysis quite a lot, and I think we need not just communication, but we need that secure funding and R&D spend that would allow that to take place. And we've seen it in the AI Security Institute. We've seen it in other areas. I think it's just about, there's people think it's like, but I think we've seen it work, we've seen it not work, but I think we've not done it in this space, so we don't know what to do there.
Finally, Natasha.
I've been waiting with patience and bated breath to speak to you, because your evidence is fascinating as a parent of 2 boys, both of them, one born in lockdown, in which screens became sort of like the thing we all clung to. This is really fascinating stuff. What we've gone back to time and time and again through this conversation is the kind of content being king, right? So not all screen time being equal, not it all being bad, and that sort of thing. And some of the previous evidence sessions we've had has been from public service broadcasters whose motivation in this space isn't necessarily monetizing their content, but providing things that are for the public good. So at the moment, the government's waiting for video sharing platforms and the public service broadcasters to work collaboratively to come up with some sort of self-regulatory, lovely thing that will happen, maybe a kite mark, as my colleague was talking about before. Do you think that that's working right now? And if not, do you think the government should be regulating in this space? And if it should be regulating, what would you like that to look like?
I mean, I would say it's working in principle. I don't think there's always knowledge dissemination. I think we're in an area, certainly my area early is neuroscience, how children and young brains process sights and sounds differently. We've really, really moved on a lot in our understanding in the past 5 years. Honestly, I see stuff on iPlayer that isn't optimally designed for my young kids' brains. But I think in principle it works. I think the desire to change is there, but it's just a question of just getting the knowledge flow happening fast enough. That would be all I'd say on that.
I think it often, with anything with these big tech giants, it often feels like a David and Goliath battle. And I think that's, it feels like that for the researcher. I think it feels like that for probably public service broadcasting. So I think we need to enable, we know that public service broadcasting that isn't driven by ad revenue is probably a really good mechanism for creating good quality content, because that's the ultimate aim. And actually it's also content created in the UK, it's created with our values, it's created in our communities. And so I think we need to make sure that it is as competitive as possible. If it's working, it's very difficult to say, right? Because we're seeing increasingly young people going to other platforms. But it's hard to say, like, oh, then all of public broadcasting isn't working if that transition is taking place, when we're seeing that those are designed specifically to ensnare attention. I think we're seeing that those tech giants are very, very successful at doing their business model.
Is there a space around, so like just quite like big thinking about it, like, you know, no, there is no limit, we don't, let's just like wipe the slate clean, start again. Is there a space in which you regulate the type of content? So just as you were talking about earlier around the food standards that we give to what's in baby formula, or the food, or the standards that we have for the kind of materials that go into toys. The reason we made those changes is because over time we saw the harms of those things. So do we go into the space of regulating, you know, how many images are flashing and that sort of thing, rather than waiting for these organisations to do it voluntarily? We make them do it.
I'd say technically it's very, very hard to, you know, ban fast-paced, you know, screen content. I think the only thing that we can do is kind of age appropriate. Is this right for your child at
maybe
a particular
you wouldn't
age?
ban it, but you would say you can't market this to children if it has this certain, you know, sort of thing.
Yeah. So that type of thing. But the problem specifically with my area early is what young brains need is very, very different to what older brains need. And what actually works very well for older brains works terribly for younger brains, which just makes it, you know, it constrains what you can do, because you can't, you know, it's not like violent content, which is bad for everybody, yeah? It's very, very specific need that young brains have. They learn very, very differently. They process sights and sounds very differently. So it has to be a age appropriateness rather than just flat out ban.
Is there any sense of maybe a cultural shift within the sector to move to monetising comprehension rather than attention?
I mean, funnily enough, Cocomelon can't sell.
But all of us, really, anyone who's online. Is there any appetite for us to move that culture towards comprehension rather than just attention?
I think there's been, so I've been doing some work on some EU Commission work where there is interest. For example, can we, instead of the algorithm always coming with a platform, could there be consumer choice, that I might want the BBC algorithm? You know, there's the sort of raw content soup that maybe a platform owns, but then there is this kind of in between where I could choose the platform's own algorithm, which might be free and might be ad driven, but I might also choose the algorithm that's developed by the BBC or somewhere else. So I'm not, and I think none of us is a policy researcher expert in this space, but I think it's something that has interested me, because I think increasingly we see this sort of raw flood of information. I think there is a role of potentially public service broadcasting or other mechanisms to help give people choice. So again, bringing it back to that choice element, that I could choose that I want the TikTok experience where like hours fly by and in like a couple of minutes when I'm stuck on a train, but I could also choose something else.
And you make it public service broadcast, like public service, so you don't then create a thing of, if you can't afford it, you get the soup, and if you can, you get the premium product where your brain isn't overstimulated. And
we're seeing that, for example, with EdTech, with other forms of technology, that there is a differential of those who have to go on the sort of free versions, and then those where the parents can choose that high quality content or pay for the high quality apps. I think we need to make sure we push against that. I think digital inequality isn't just about digital access, it's about access to certain features and high quality features. And again, that comes back to what I said earlier. We're in that space where we do assume everything should be freely available, but we do need that basis level of good quality content, good quality software, good quality apps that are available to all, that will cost money to make. And the question is, who will cover that?
I have one final question. I've wondered, like, how much interaction or discussion you've had with, you know, the parents in these organisations that are creating these things, and whether they let their children use these platforms and how they let their children use these platforms.
Good question. I haven't.
No. I think naturally there are all these media articles about how the Silicon Valley executives send their children to screen-free schools, and I think it comes back to which parent has that choice, right? There's a certain amount of income that will allow you to have that childcare, to have all those after-school clubs, to keep your child entertained, to have a big garden where they can climb a tree, and a safe neighborhood where they can go over and meet their friends. I think we need to really understand that for some kids, going out on the street can be unsafe. That hour not spent on a screen isn't an hour playing in the garden because they don't have access to a nice quality playground in where they're living. So I think we should think about the tech bosses, but we also need to understand that there's a lived reality of that. The choices that they make is, even if certain parents would want to make them, they might be out of their current reach even. And I think we need to reflect on that as well.
I completely agree. I mean, that makes sense. But I suppose that the thing is if you're building online worlds for young people, securing the knowledge that your children aren't experiencing that, then maybe you would put guardrails in that you'd put in for your own kids, that you should put them for the rest of the world's kids, maybe.
Well, I think you're questioning I think you're inviting some tech boss, so I think that's a very great question to ask them.
Thank you, Natasha. So with Australia having their ban on social media for under 16s, are you aware that they're in any way kind of backfilling the availability of content or the funding of content on public service media in order to provide enough watching for that age group?
I'm actually not sure, but I haven't heard that they are doing that. I think there was a large amount of debate in Australia what you will fill that time with, and how you will enable children to, for example, go out and play footy as they were hoping them to do. And I think that's the same, for example, with the Play Commission here in the UK. I think a big thing that came out is that we need to give young people the space to play and to do things that are not digital. We've just done some interview work with young people where they're saying, well, we would love to meet up, but actually we're sort of stuck in our homes. And then in the winter it's dark and there's not really a space for us to, hang out. And these were teenagers. So I think we critically need to think about, if we want to remove screen content, what do we replace that with? Because I think the path of least resistance will potentially not be the things we would want people to replace that time with. And I think we need to think about children's rights and their limitations they've experienced post-pandemic, where we are giving them a lot less freedom, a lot less opportunity to go out and take risks. So to be fair, I think it's all connected. And I think we often focus on the screens, but there are a lot of other changes that have happened in our society that have potentially been helped, enabled, a consequence of screens. It's all one big complex system. I don't know. I know.
No, it's a great question. I don't mean to do It's good.
One final question for all of you. Can any of you give me an example where a video sharing platform has acted to help actually promote high quality educational content?
Video sharing platform specifically, as opposed to posting content from somewhere else?
So are there any video sharing platforms that have taken steps to actively help promote educational high quality content?
Not that I'm aware of. No.
Okay.
It's not my area of work to track.
In the same way that our PSBs, they collate high quality content, so that it's there for our children.
It's a good question. It's not my expertise, but it's a really, really interesting question, actually. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. Was there any final points that you wanted to land with us before we finally let you escape?
No, I don't think so. That's great questions.
In which case, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure to see you.
Thank you.
Order.
Thank you.
Thank you.